All right, everyone. Hello and welcome back to Dan's Astrology. I'm recording this on Monday, the 18th of August, and up on the screen here, I have the chart for the 22nd of August, where there will be a new moon in Virgo. And I was just examining this lunation and noticing it is interesting for a number of reasons. Basically, because we're not going to have just one new moon in Virgo, we're going to have two new moons in Virgo. And it's going to be, we're approaching eclipse season, but because the North Node is at 18 degrees Pisces and the new moon, the first one is only at the very beginning, 00 of Virgo, it will not really be, we're not really going to have a Virgo solar eclipse until the second new moon. And so I'm just going to show you what that looks like. So on the 22nd, we have this new moon in Virgo. And as we progress along here, eventually we're going to have a full moon lunar eclipse in Pisces. And that is going to be influenced by a retrograde Saturn, which will retrograde inverse back into Pisces around this time. And because it's a water, I mean, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself because we're talking about this Pisces full moon lunar eclipse with Saturn and the North Node. And it seems, just looking at this, to be kind of emotional, maybe a bit depressing. So at least heads up for that one. And I think Pisces always kind of comes off that way to me, especially when it's a full moon. And then when you've got Saturn there too. As you keep going, then we have at the end, or once we get into September, approaching the equinox, we have at the very end of summer, basically right before the fall equinox, we have a second new moon in Virgo. This time, here, if this time it's interesting because this will be an exact opposition when this new moon is perfectly conjunct. There will be an exact opposition to Saturn in Pisces, which is retrograde, and it'll be a solar eclipse, but with the North Node at 18 degrees, that's a good 10 degrees away from where so it's not going to be like the biggest solar eclipse. So we're probably going to be getting stronger solar eclipses next year, basically. But with the opposition to Saturn, there's I'll be talking more about this later. Of course, we're looking at a whole month ahead, defined by this eclipse season. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it back, and I'm going to look at the one coming up, this new moon. As you can see here, the new moon will be in its balsamic phase in Leo, and then just as soon as the sun ingresses into Virgo, shortly thereafter, the balsamic moon will cross over into Virgo as well and create the new moon right at the very 00 degree of Virgo. And one of the things that I find is particularly interesting about this is that if we notice what kind of aspects it's making, the strongest aspect is clearly, you can see Uranus here in the chart is on the ascendant that I have, but it's at the very first degree of Gemini, so making a square just by 1 degree orb to the new moon in Virgo. And of course, they're both being squared in mutable Mercury ruled signs, and Uranus has a lot to do with technology and technological disruption, things like that. And also, it stood for liberation, freedom. So we could see a lot of like I also basically want to keep in mind that you can approach this dynamic from a number of different angles, perhaps how it may influence your own personal life, but then as well there's obviously major geopolitical political, national controversial things going on in the world. And I am as an astrologer, I have to admit I don't always get it right. Sometimes I do. I was kind of, because I have my own attachments, I suppose, into to what I would like to see happen in the world and what I would not like to see happen. Sometimes, perhaps, I am prone to wishful thinking or trying to spin things certain ways, and it doesn't turn out that way. But there is at least a lot of stuff going on in the news recently around um, basically the protests against things which I don't have to get into the details. You know that what the protests are about, as well as certain laws that are certain shakeups that are happening around the internet, around data privacy, around freedom of speech, and all this kind of stuff. And because Uranus is a technological signifier, as well as something to do with freedom and liberty and protests and stuff like that, I would suggest that this new moon with a square to Uranus would highlight both those themes. But then if you also consider here that the sign of Virgo, what is Virgo all about, right? It's oftentimes the Virgo, we talk about like the maiden in the field, or there's this whole thing about virginity, which is kind of awkward to get into, but it's basically meant to be a signifier for a kind of the worldliness as well as transcendence, where there's something about being in the world but not of it, or being sort of, there's a certain tangible practicality about Virgo, but there's also a certain air of detachment, of having the ability to detach yourself from the present situation and what's most immediately at hand, and you have the ability to use your imagination and your intelligence to look at the situation that we're in and plan for the future, basically, right? And that you can understand that with Virgo, they're mutable signs, and it's all about this is all happening around the fall equinox. So there's the idea of a seasonal change, a changing of the seasons, a changing of world politics, a changing of your own life circumstances, and that at least we have the intelligence and the maturity that it takes to observe the situation that we're in, and that we can make the appropriate plans for what is to come, right? Now, with this in mind, I think there's some important things to consider about all this, in that you don't want to take that archetype of trying to observe the situation and plan for the future and become a total doomsday prepper, right? Or at least, I don't know, I mean, maybe some people are like that, but I have to admit that when I spend time on the internet, sometimes I don't know what the hell I'm doing in terms of what the algorithm. You might you might see that I had a pop up for that one of these like incognito things. I probably have just messed. I think the algorithm. I think what's the internet for, right? I think in some way. I think it's a mistake to think that you have to be overly precious about your algorithm. Why not just mess it up and get all sorts of strange recommendations? And like but I personally don't identify as one of these like doomsday survival prepper kind of guys. And I have to admit that there's always going to be that kind of a demographic. It's just not my mentality. But you have to look at the situation that we're actually dealing with. The fact that I am a Canadian, first of all, gives me a bit of certain degree of separation from everything that's happening in the United States. But there's a certain, when you think about Virgo, the ability to have this sort of level of detachment or whatever from what's going on, a sort of level of removal from you can sort of, hopefully it should also the ability to plan for the future with a certain degree of sobriety and cool-headedness, and not this whole kind of alarmist Chicken Little end of the world kind of stuff, right? And if anything, though, I think that part of the issue is that we're always kind of just waiting for something to happen just like immediately, when one of the great things about being an astrologer is that we have the ability to compare the astrological dynamic that we are dealing with right now, and then compare that with like what's it going to look like in the future, let's say a year from now. One of the things about this is that we recently had some intense astrology set off with this Mars and Libra making an opposition to Saturn and Neptune. For example, with America, you have this thing where in Texas, they're trying to gerrymander. I think this is great with, if you think about Saturn and Neptune having to do with boundaries, and the illusion, like Neptune being kind of illusory, right? Like depending on where you set your boundaries for various voting districts, you can create the illusion of having more support, having more popular vote than if you weren't gerrymandering. And there's this whole controversy where the Democrats have ran away from Texas and refused to even show up for the meeting because they refused to give into this gerrymandering things. And then you have the Californian Democrats who are arguing or trying to make this strategy that if we can't stop the Republicans from gerrymandering, at least we can use that as a precedent to play dirty ourselves and then gerrymander our own states in the other favor, right? So there's no even pretense anymore to playing. And I think that sort of Mars in Libra has sort of set off that. And there's also whatever the hell is going on in Washington, D.C. right now, right? There's images of, huge homeless encampments being removed and cleared out and all this kind of stuff. And this is sort of set. I saw it in the midst of all this, some guy who is like making a video saying, "Don't be a crybaby about it. You need to be mature and plan and all." And it's like this whole kind of like, it's the end of the society, civilization is going to crash down, and we got to be a survival prepper. Well, in all of this, all I can say is that if you give yourself a certain time frame and you look at what's happening now, and like if we look ahead a year from now, check this out. Especially, okay, let's just I'm just kind of hold on. Maybe this is a bit of a mess. We don't want to go by hours here. We want to go by like weeks or something. Basically, Jupiter, which is in Cancer, is going to go into Leo next year. And when it does, it is going to create this opposition from Leo. Well, I have to also remind you that when it comes to astrological aspects, the strongest one is a conjunction, which technically isn't even an aspect, right? But the strongest aspect is the opposition. And so next year, we are going to get Jupiter opposing Pluto, and then we are also going to get both Mars and Uranus in Gemini, which is, unfortunately, for those of you who know what the American Sibley Chart looks like, the chart that was drafted up in 1776 on the 4th of July, that one, America has Sag rising and Uranus and Mars in Gemini in the 7th house. So this is a very strong signifier for America being at war next year. And the basic thing about this is that because America is in a kind of they have a lot of debt, right? For one thing, they have a lot of debt, but they also have a lot of money invested into their military. But at this current point in time, they have to spend more money paying off their debts than they're able to invest in their military. So this has put them in an increasingly erratic and desperate scramble to try to push other countries to invest in military stuff so they can withdraw from that because they can't afford it. Their financing is fucked, basically, right? And there's this kind of issue around all this where there's a kind of a lot of pressure on us, like from a Canadian perspective, that we are being pressured to militarize, to pick up the slack because America has mismanaged its, like, the whole American way of doing business is going to come to some sort of confrontation that's going to push them into war. That's going to put pressure on other countries to go to war too. And this is whether it's going to be a total collapse of society or not, who knows? But the astrology next year looks even worse, perhaps, than the astrology this year, if you factor that in, right? Now, why am I bringing this up now? Well, if you go back, let's take it back to the topic at hand here. The planet Uranus, Richard Tarnas has argued that should be considered less to do with Uranus, the sky god, and more to do with Uranus or Prometheus archetype, basically, right? Prometheus was said to be the god of foresight, right? And Virgo, the field maiden, is all about planning for the seasonal change, the harvest season, the coming of the winter. Are you going to have enough grain to support yourself throughout the winter months? And with this in mind, I think that we're getting this interesting lunar cycle coming up where we get not just one, but two new moons in Virgo. The first of which will be in a direct square to Uranus, this god of technological innovation, disruption, protest, revolution, as well as foresight for the future, right? And because we are astrology enthusiasts here, if you're watching this channel, we at least have the gift of astrological divination to give us this view of the future that we can understand that while things may not immediately go to shit this year all at once right now, that things look pretty hairy next year, and we can almost guarantee there's going to be some kind of violent conflict involving the United States, and even they are planning for this and are trying to make other governments, putting pressure on them to go to war as well, right? And in all of this, there's something about the Uranus and the Virgo, perhaps as resonating with the archetype in there's a certain form of tarot astrology association where the Virgo is associated with the Hermit, right? The Hermit is also similar to the old desert fathers of Christianity, people who decided to separate themselves from worldly attachment, from involvement in society, and retreat into the desert for a life of contemplation, removed from all the conflicts and dramas of the outside world, right? So I think one of the valid options for planning ahead in the future is not to figure out how to further embroil yourself in these political dramas that are going to inevitably play out on the world stage, but rather to perhaps retreat and to find a life of spiritual contemplation, removed and distant from all this drama and all this bullshit. And there's a certain liberation of that, because if you could choose not to get involved in all of that and just ride it out like a monk in the desert, why not go for that rather than embroil yourself in all these pointless all these conflicts? Like history, don't get me wrong, history is not over. History is going to play itself out, but do you want to be like standing in the way of that, the wheels of time just going to run you over like a tank or something like that? You have the opportunity to liberate yourself of that and get the fuck out of there. It's also interesting to consider that in when it came to like World War II, what happened with the Nazis in Germany, and this whole archetype of foresight, that there were plenty of Jewish people who predicted exactly what was going to happen, or at least could see that it looked like a pretty bad situation to be in, if to do the math, and you can just get yourself out of there before it becomes a problem, right? There were people that had that foresight who got themselves out of there. Whereas I don't know if we're already too like, if it's kind of pointless to suggest this at this point, but I think there's basically like a certain dynamic of, the opportunity to be, or to be the choice. Do we have choices? Do we involve ourselves in protest, or do we choose a path of like detachment, to just that we don't owe it to the world to get involved in all that drama, and that we can just ride it out and let history take its course without that kind of involvement. There's another sort of angle on this that I was thinking about as well too, in that Uranus is something we're said to be liberated by technology somehow, right? I'm not really sure how this works. One of the things that I like to do is I like to read Marshall McLuhan. And Marshall McLuhan makes the argument that the more that we use technology, we're actually not liberated at all. We're actually more dependent, right? Because this is kind of funny. Like, if you are saying that, like, before I was a car owner, I was dependent on the bus driver and the city and their bus schedule for getting me around. But now that I have my own car, I can just go wherever I want, whenever I want, and I don't have to. Because you basically consider that whatever, it's not like when you think about the vehicle, its manufacturing process, the raw materials that went into that, the engineers who did that, any mechanical help you may need, wherever your gas is being sourced from, the people who work on the oil rigs. These people aren't things that you are dependent. You're just a strong, independent man who has completely entitled to as much gas as he wants, who can just drive cars around for the rest. Like, this is all just your entitlement that props up you as an individual person, and you just consider that to be being independent. But the truth is that the more you're dependent on those systems, the more you're actually not dependent, right? And there's something I was thinking about this in terms of when it's masculine coded, there are certain technological products, like if a pickup truck gives you the sense of being a strong, independent man, because like if you're this is the idea, right? Like, if you have a pickup truck and your wife, her car breaks down, then you could maybe well, you don't have a tow truck, right? But you know what I'm trying to say? You could tow shit around, right? You can, I don't really know, like, there's some kind of thing of like, if by owning the means of production, you have but you never own all of it. You're always dependent on these supply chains, on these resources, on these fuel sources. To be truly independent would be basically to be like a very low-tech person who's living just on your own wits and resources. But then, even if that's your version of independent, you still have to be living in adaptation to your environment, right? Because you're not going to be like, people could say that the technology of a car, if you're driving around in like a luxury automobile where you've got the suspension of the car makes it so you can't even feel the bumps on the road, and you've got like air conditioning so you can't hear the heat outside, and you've got some classical music playing so that you don't even know where you are, and you've got like autopilot on, like you're completely just you're like, I'm completely independent from this world around me. But then when your car breaks down, then you're like, oh, now I actually have to think about what the actual world is, and I have to like pay, and I'm I've lost this technology has granted me this independence from my environment. Now I actually have to be like, oh, wait a minute. I have to think about my body, how much energy my body has, and whether that's enough energy to get me from place A to place B, rather than existing in this sort of like this state of luxury bubble that just floats over everything without paying attention to the actual world that you are grounded into, right? But we call the being put back into that world, being made more dependent on the organic, natural environment, like fresh air, clean drinking water, having trees around that filter carbon dioxide into oxygen for us. This is all dependency, right? Being independent means to be having the resources to harness the sources of industry to build a fucking rocket ship to take you to some other planet, so you can just fucking not even have to worry about Earth. You don't even have to. That's what independence means, right? And so this is crazy dynamic I find with Uranus, where it's like, what does it mean to be like made to be liberated and made free when it's actually another like, I was thinking about this in terms of the masculine coding is all about like pickup trucks and rocket ships and stuff like that. Female coding is all instead, there's a certain sexism to this, where if your technology is, let's say, like hair dryers or like blenders, or like if your technology is like kitchen appliances, right? If you're like, okay, so I'm liberated from having to knead bread by hand because I have a bread machine, right? Or I'm liberated from having to flip a grilled cheese sandwich on my frying pan because I have a fancy panini sandwich maker, right? This is like, on some way is liberating, but then when you start to like, eventually you get to this thing where you're like, oh, I'm gonna buy myself another pressure cooker or another slow cooker or another air fryer, but oh, wait a minute, I've already got like 5 blenders, a Vitamix, like a microwave oven, an espresso machine, and like you start to be like, I have no fucking room for any of this shit, right? And then you're like, wait a minute, so like I'm liberated from all these pointless tasks, and I've got a fucking robot army to do all this fucking work for me, but I don't have any fucking where to plug this in. I like, half this shit is broken now, and I'm just drowning in fucking garbage. And I would actually really appreciate just to live a simple life where I wouldn't have all this fucking bullshit to deal with. And so what does it actually mean? Like, at what point does the promise of liberating technology just starts to feel like a bunch of awkward attachments that you're drowning in a bunch of clutter and a bunch of bullshit, and you don't, like, how is this making my life better? It's just making my life more of a burden, right? And so like, there's this kind of thing, like this, you can see this archetype in movies. I'm thinking first of all in Spaceballs, there's like the desert scene where you're like, take only what you need to survive, right? But then if you've got like the hair dryer, the blender, you have to like take this huge, and you're like, oh, like the as a kind of a comedic illustration of this principle of being like the ascetic, non-attached Jedi out in the desert who has versus having to like the feminine codedness of having all these stupid appliances and trinkets and stuff. But then when it's a masculine thing, and you've got like a vehicle, or you've got a rocket ship, or you've got all other sorts of tools or technological equipment that are considered to be male coded, these are just things that make you more of an independent person, not a source of needy attachment and dependency, right? It's actually in some, and this is only the argument is made because of utilitarianism, I guess, right? The other thing I was thinking of is a movie which I got for Christmas last year, Terry Gilliam's Brazil. And in Terry Gilliam's Brazil, I think there's an excellent example of this where there's a certain retrofuturism going on, where things are both highly technologically advanced as well as exaggeratedly old school, in the fact that you have like imagine if you had a very sophisticated computer system, but it was all analog. Like it was a bunch of like a complex system of tubes that were delivering printed messages and you would deliver messages to people by putting them in vacuum tubes or whatever, right? It's kind of like, I think like 1984, the way they did it was a little bit like this, right? But imagine having a very retro futurist kind of idea, this retrofuturism that didn't imagine digital technology, but nevertheless imagined things being very technologically advanced, right? And that in this world, things become technologically advanced to the point where they just become pointless, where it's like, in order to answer your telephone, you have to like enter your password and connect, it's like you've got all these, like, we've created this like technological world where instead of things making our lives more simple, they make everything much more complicated, right? And it's like, it's turned this thing where what originally we imagined as something that liberates us, now it becomes something which imprisons us, which is a means of surveillance or control or something like that, or there's something that has become so overly complicated that the original thing it was meant to do to make our lives easier has just become cartoonishly the other direction, where all the things that were meant to simplify our life has now just made life more complicated. And instead of seeing technology as something that liberates us from the previous burdens of life, it has now just become its own burden that we want to be liberated from. And this has often creates a kind of a desire for anti-modernism, right? Or this withdrawal to a pre-modern society, going back to becoming Amish, basically, right? Like a rejection of technology, a rejection of technological progress, of a futuristic society, and a regression towards traditional values and beliefs and stuff like that. There's also, you know what, I will put it in the link. I was listening to a band last night called Clock DVA, who a couple of years ago released an album or a song that was called Acceleration. And in that song, they say, one of the lyrics go, change happening too fast, change that isn't going to last, or something along those lines, right? I think this is what's some sort of like dynamic about we're obviously in a certain period of time right now where times they are changing, but there's a sense that if the changes that attempt to be put into place right now are happening in a way which is too fast, chaotic. There's this kind of idea that Steve Bannon had with MAGA and Donald Trump, like to just try to do as much stuff do lots of stuff as quickly as possible and just try to like push it through, and it'll be so overwhelming that people won't be able to fight against it. But it's like, if the more you try to do that disrupting stuff in a very overwhelming way that is trying to do as much of it as possible and is in a very short period of time, it's like you are creating an inherent, like there's something about Uranus which is inherently not very stable, right? And I think what we're approaching with this is a very chaotic, disrupting feeling situation where we are under pressure to make plans for the future in a very chaotic and disrupted situation where it may be kind of anxiety provoking or destabilizing even to try to do this, because it feels like we're not standing on stable ground to be able to predict exactly what we're going to plan for. It's like things are too chaotic, right? But nevertheless, there's a certain collective mentality of like the doomsday survival preppers that don't be a little girl about it. Be a man. You gotta prep by creating a collection of all these manly independent. You're gonna have your guns and your pickup trucks, and you're just gonna be like some super soldier out in the middle of the woods with night vision goggles, like, and you're gonna be like hyper vigilant not just for what's gonna happen now, but you're gonna just be built up in this sort of like, oh, I'm nobody, like I'm just on my own. In the woods, like just hyper vigilant, like afraid of the whole world which is coming to get me. But I'm ready, I'm prepared, and I'm gonna survive. Like this is kind of like the mentality of what seems to be out there right now, and that if like in the midst of like but it's like the same guys who have this mentality seem to be also the ones that are like, they're the ones like, why can't, if you're just unhoused homeless person living on the street in DC, like you're like, I mean, it's not an ideal circumstance of living, but I mean, you're surviving. And then the funny about survival is, even if ICE catches you, rounds you up, and puts you in fucking some sort of like, concentration camp or something like that, you're still basically surviving up to a point, right? Unless they kill you or So like the whole point. There's like, the funny thing about this is like, I mean, what does it mean? What does it mean survival? Even if you're in jail, you're surviving, right? Even if you are a political refugee, you're surviving. What like the only real threat against survival are these crazy fuckers who feel like they have to like. You know what I'm trying to say? It's like there's like the person who is like somehow it's like the shadow projection where the person who is the most locked into this like end of the world survival mode is probably the person who is themselves the greatest danger to other people's survival because they're so hyper vigilant and like they have to protect themselves from all the people who want to take their guns and trucks away to make them dependent on the communist nanny state, basically, right? This is what we're dealing with, I think. So I don't know. Make of it what you will. Thanks for watching. Tune in next time for more. I'll be back later. Okay.